Our first reigning king to ever visit these shores.
They are waiting to catch a glimpse of the King and Queen.
King Charles and Queen Camilla have been and gone in Australia. There were the usual cultural exchanges.
It's no wonder, I think, that Sydney is the world famous for its cuisine. Whether it's smash avo, a pab or a cab sad.
Official ceremonies.
In my many visits to Australia, I have witnessed the courage and hope that have guided the nation's long and sometimes difficult journey towards reconciliation.
Speeches and pleasantries, and of course, the ecstatic fans.
Everything pleasant to see you guys. That was just...
But it wasn't all just royal charm and burnt sausages. Because amidst the usual quaint pageantry, one moment stood out when a First Nations senator seized the floor and gave the stunned royal retinue a piece of her mind. The king looked gobsmacked. His queen laughed nervously at the outburst. But the moment forced many of us, once again, to confront a hard truth. History isn't water under the bridge for those still drowning beneath it. This is part 2 of our look at the British royal family's trip to Australia and the Pacific. In this episode, we travel the breadth of the empire from Australia, Samoa to the Caribbean and India, as we try to understand what role the royals play in 2024 in repairing the harms of empire. I'm Emma Hoy. You're listening to Leave It to the Experts. That's independent Australian Senator Lydia Thorpe telling King Charles in the Great Hall of Canberra's Parliament House, "Give us back what you stole. This is not your land." In her hand, a letter accusing the British Crown of complicity in Aboriginal genocide under international law. The reaction to Thorpe's protest from local media was immediate and mixed, to say the least, with some hailing Thorpe's defiance and others blasting it as a pointless breach of decorum.
I want to call for Lydia Thorpe's resignation from the Federal Senate. She had a red-hot go at King Charles yesterday before being ejected from the Great Hall of the Parliament. But Lydia Thorpe is an embarrassment.
Back in Britain, the senator's intended message was largely lost, flattened into tabloid outrage.
A bit of a hysterical harpy, I think you described that.
I was so interested to see what happened in Australia there.
Meanwhile, Thorpe defended her actions.
I did it for truth-telling, global truth-telling about the royals who caused so much devastation to not only our people in this country, but Indigenous people around the world. We don't have a treaty in this country. We've been calling for decades and decades for a treaty. We just want peace.
And yet, with each attempt to explain, the debate drifted further from its original purpose. Thorpe wanted a conversation about history, colonial violence, reparations and justice.
I think it's very different, the sort of Caribbean issue, the issue of reparations and the issue of the Indigenous rights here.
Instead, a moment that could have turned into a meaningful dialogue about colonial legacies was downplayed.
I mean, the royal family are used to this, aren't they, when they go to certain places that are after their independence.
But why do people I just don't understand why people get so worked up about things like this. She doesn't sound too Indigenous to me with a name like Lydia Thorpe.
Reframed and twisted, with perhaps the most extreme example coming from British journalist Mike Parry.
Mike, we never have had a proper reckoning. We sort of talk as if Australia was discovered and it was a convict colony.
Well,
we don't make the point, rather like USA, that there were people there before.
A very small number of people there. I mean, I don't believe there is a colonial aspect to Australia. Captain Cook arrived in Botany Bay in 1770. That's when he landed. That's when we first set foot on Australia. I don't think we colonised it. We built Australia.
In 2024, this level of commitment to a rose-tinted version of history is no small feat. It takes real dedication in an age where the unvarnished historical record is just a click away. For Indigenous activists, the moment was yet another missed opportunity. The chance to engage directly with the British monarch has slipped away, drowned out amidst attempts to gain political capital.
I don't think it worked. I don't think it got the message through to anyone in the room.
Listening to the back and forth, the stark divide in this debate is striking, and many still don't seem to acknowledge that there's even any issue to discuss. So where do we start? Is the King the right person to lead this conversation, or are there other frameworks to better address these deep-seated issues? Let's ask our first expert, Dr. Francesca Dominello. She's a senior lecturer at the Macquarie University Law School, researching the law's interaction with Indigenous people and social justice, and is also author of the book State Apologies to Indigenous People. Dr. Francesca Dominello, thank you so much for joining us on Leave It to the Experts.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
When it comes to reparations for centuries of colonial rule across hundreds of territories around all corners of the globe, where and how does a huge process like that even begin?
Usually in history, it begins by the survivors agitating for recognition. So their histories are not anything new to them, but often they're histories that have been marginalised, silenced by the dominant society, lawmakers, etc.
When it comes to these kind of settlements and figures, so for example, the British Prime Minister and King Charles are said to be preparing to be handed a £200 billion bill by some Commonwealth nations at the upcoming CHOGA meeting in Samoa. How do they come to these kinds of figures when it comes to prosecuting crimes of the past?
My experience from my research, it's never enough. So even though it's in the billions of dollars, it's just not enough. The damage that's been caused is so deep. It's not just the people who were first affected by the harms. There's intergenerational trauma because the harms haven't been dealt with. This is a problem with these historical wrongs in a country like Australia where the reparation schemes have been state-based. And so the states are offering these schemes, $5 million in Tasmania. I think it was $11 million in South Australia. And then in other places, it's more, we're not going to put a cap on the amount. You can just apply for a certain amount. And so in South Australia, in the end, even though it was an $11 million fund, I think they were the applicants, the survivors were awarded $20,000 each or maybe $30,000 each. And then you compare that to New South Wales. So their Stolen Generation scheme has offered $75,000 and now the Victorian scheme is offering $100,000. And you wonder, how do they come up with these figures? I mean, they're different. No two people have experienced the same thing, but the general harm of being removed from your family, that is a harm that's being sought to be addressed by these schemes, and it's not enough. It's never enough.
Australia, the Australian government and state governments so far have been the ones paying the bills. They're the ones that are financially liable. But Australia is not a republic. We're part of the Commonwealth. And, you know, a lot of the wealth that was arising as a result of kind of stolen labour and minerals and resources was being funneled back to the British Empire, as we know. So do you believe that the wealth of the British royal family or sort of wealthier families that have previously been involved should also be at stake here, or is it just the role of government?
In Australia, I think in the 1930s, there were petitions to the King by Indigenous people seeking help from the King, like recognising that the Australian governments were not helping and that they needed interference from the Crown to assist. And the Crown declined. I do think the Crown does have a role to play. If you go back to the beginning of it all, they were the ones that sent Captain Cook off to Australia. And then Captain Cook was supposed to get the consent of the natives, in inverted commas, and he didn't. And then Arthur Phillip came along with the first fleet, and he was to conciliate with the natives, no longer to gain a consent, because I think they'd realised by that stage that Aboriginal people weren't going to give up their lands easily. The Crown was aware of the atrocities that were going on in Australia at the time, but let it go. And I think that needs to be addressed. The fact that they knew, and they willfully turned a blind eye. They didn't step in to put the colonisers in place and to adhere to British colonial laws at the time. So there's a lot of things that occurred to, a lot of the atrocities that occurred to Indigenous people in Australia were not just infringements of Indigenous customary laws, but they were infringements of British colonial laws as well. And that, I think, that needs to be addressed.
Reparations can take many forms beyond just financial compensation. And do you think there are alternative approaches to addressing these kind of historical injustices?
There is in international law a framework for setting up a reparations scheme. So that's the basic principles and guidelines for reparations for human rights abuses and violations of humanitarian law. And I mean, that's an aspirational document, but it does set up a good framework that could be followed. And it's a framework that would be victim-centred. And it's not just, the redress wouldn't just be monetary redress. There are other kinds of redress that's available under this model. So things like non-repetition of harm. So getting guarantees that the harm will never happen again. Rehabilitation. So services provided to the survivors to overcome the harms. And it's not just survivors, it's their descendants. So dealing with the intergenerational trauma. There'd be restitution, so restoration of lost lands, for instance. And then there's satisfaction as well. So satisfaction relates to truth-telling processes, so making apologies. Truth-telling processes, not only just being able to tell the truth, but finding out the truth, finding out what happened to loved ones that have who have disappeared or have been murdered. So it would be incredibly holistic, but it would be driven by survivors. I think reparations schemes need to turn attention to the people. I think there needs to be education. I think that comes under satisfaction, education of the general population, particularly when the group, for instance, Indigenous people, are a minority. It's very difficult for the general population to take up the cause and change and recognise that they're benefiting from it, that their institutions are actually perpetuating the wrongs. Government needs to play a leading role in that.
Dr. Francesca Dominello, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope that people benefit from what I've had to say. Thank you.
2 years ago, King Charles took one small step for man, one giant leap forward for the British monarchy, when he publicly acknowledged the British Empire's painful legacy of slavery and colonialism.
I want to acknowledge that the roots of our contemporary association run deep into the most painful period of our history. I cannot describe the depths of my personal sorrow at the suffering of so many, as I continue to deepen my own understanding of slavery's enduring impact.
Now, as he and Camilla make their way to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, a growing number of former colonies are calling on him and his Prime Minister to back that rhetoric up with concrete action and cold, hard cash. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has remained staunchly adamant that the British government does not and will not pay for the past crimes of empire. a stance backed firmly by a chorus of voices resistant to dialogue on the issue.
Because, my God, we've had so many calls over recent years from, let's face it, the grifters in developing nations and poorer nations who frankly think, yeah, Britain's rich, other countries in Europe are rich, let's get a bit of money out of them. That's what this is.
But with more and more Commonwealth nations becoming increasingly vocal on the issue, King Charles, Queen Camilla and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer look set to face a reparations minefield when they arrive in Samoa. The three candidates vying to be elected Commonwealth Secretary-General at the summit are from Gambia, Ghana and Lesotho, and all three are calling for reparations for countries affected by slavery and colonialism.
Financial reparations is good. However, the conversation is now moving to other reparations in kind.
The Commonwealth has a role because it is an issue that affects more than half of the members of the Commonwealth.
This is it's a noble cause that has to be championed by member states.
15 Caribbean nations are also expected to present renewed reparations demands to UK representatives, with some estimates exceeding £200 billion. These demands, they say, are a just reflection of the ongoing and very real repercussions of colonialism they're still dealing with today. To try and understand those repercussions in the Pacific context, let's bring in Professor Giochi Ravulo, Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies at the University of Sydney and an adjunct professor in the School of Law and Social Sciences at the University of South Pacific. Professor Ravulo, thank you so much for joining us on Leave It to the Experts.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, firstly, as both a Pacifica man and someone who's spent a great deal of time researching the impacts of policy and institutions on communities, when you hear that the British Royals are arriving in the Pacific, what's your initial personal reaction?
There's mixed reactions. I think it's lovely to see that the Royals are coming and providing scope to highlight strengths and capabilities and also challenges and the possibilities based on the region. But a lot of the time, those issues in the region is because of colonisation, is because of the British Empire. So I have mixed emotions associated with the British Royal, the lineage and the legacy of what that represents.
Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the other impacts that are still being felt in the region today as a result of British colonisation?
So a lot of our social structures, systems and services are based on Western and white values and views, perspectives and practices. So when we as Pacific Indigenous people go to a health facility to receive medical support, we're not necessarily receiving that support from a Pacific Indigenous-led point of view. It's still within a Western and white framing, and our health then is treated accordingly to that. And that then creates ongoing issues with our health and well-being. Traditionally, in Pacific Indigenous perspectives and practices, help is just what you do as an everyday reality. We live within the collective. There's a reciprocity that exists in everything that we do. But even in the legal context, even how we deal with the law and how we as citizens interact with the law, again, is within a Western and white framing.
One of the major issues that's going to be discussed at the next Commonwealth meeting is reparations for some of the damages caused by the British Empire. So how do we even begin that conversation, and where would you like to see that issue move forward?
So reparations is a great way of looking at the notion of responsibility. However, it's the process that can become tricky. Who then is held responsible for those reparations? Is it the local governments that then need to budget into their budgets amounts to then pay those that have been wronged? Or is it, again, King Charles himself and the wealth that they've amassed because of the British Empire? Did they provide funds out of their own pockets for those reparations to be undertaken? So those specific nuances and details. So conceptually, great, reparations, I think, is something that we should be leaning into. But how we do that will matter.
Do you think that King Charles and the sort of private wealth of the royal family should be fair play when it comes to reparations?
Look, yes, because we know that their wealth is a result of colonisation, of the land grabs and the looting that the British Army and those representing the empire undertook and did as part of the expansion of imperialism, of this idea of we're going to go in there and we're going to even civilize those that should be civilized. So even the concepts of colonization continues to pervade the way in which we understand the region. I know that in my conversations with fellow Australians and although other Western countries, we still constantly see the Pacific as needing to be developed. So this ongoing paternalistic view of the region continues to play out. What we fail to do then is actually look at why they occurs in the first place. And it's because we continue to live out a colonial legacy of people in the Pacific being lower or less than.
Well, we see quite a passive stance in a lot of ways from the royal family today when it comes to taking and accepting responsibility for the actions of their ancestors. They're sort of now claiming to be a force for good in improving the lives of Indigenous communities in former colonies. You know, they sort of claim that they're going to listen to the issues and attempt to facilitate dialogue in whatever way they can. What's your reaction to that assertion?
Look, I'm all for dialogue. In Pacific Indigenous communities, we have a concept called talanoa, which is to have a collective and collaborative conversation, to have a conversation where you hold and share space, where you nurture the sacred space, the relationships that we have with each other. So I'm all about that because that then creates a sense of connection and community. And if they then genuinely have that connection with our community, then they should be able to see their shared responsibility in creating those solutions.
You're about to attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or CHOGM, as it's known in Samoa. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you're personally hoping to do and achieve while you're there, and sort of more broadly, what outcomes you'd like to see from this summit?
Sustainable solutions around climate action and climate justice. Sustainable solutions when it comes to the meaningful integration, incorporation of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming in our social system structures and services. If we can further highlight the importance of Indigenous practices and perspectives through the conversations at CHOGM, the Commonwealth should hopefully understand the importance of that and how they can continue to empower the systems and structures that they have left behind to be inclusive of those Indigenous First Nations perspectives and practices. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that people will start the critical conversation or the ongoing critical conversation around First Nations sovereignty and their rights to having safe and equitable societies that are reflective in the social systems, structures and services.
And one final question, just in case you do happen to come across His Majesty at CHOGM, will you be giving your best bow?
Of course, I've actually interacted previously with his sister, Her Royal Highness Princess Anne. So I've had the protocols briefed and I understand how that works. Look, I am someone that does respect people based on, who they are. Look, I'm all about that. However, I'm also all about having critical conversations with people to ensure that they are responsible, that they are also part of the shared conversation and solution moving ahead.
Right, so maybe a bow and then a little tough conversation just on it. We'll be looking forward to that. Professor
Exactly, Emma.
Giochi Rubelwood, thank you so much for joining us today. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. For more, head to 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists, then understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Gaselli. Music by Jan Skubaszewski at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.